It's 6:56 p.m., March 20th, 2023. I'm resuming my reading. V.I. Lenin, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. Page 52. Section 3. Finance Capital and the Financial Oligarchy. Quote, a steadily increasing proportion of capital in industry, writes Hilferding, ceases to belong to the industrialists who employ it. They obtain the use of it only through the medium of the banks which, in relation to them, represent the owners of the capital. On the other hand, the bank is forced to sink an increasing share of its funds in industry. Thus, to an ever-increasing degree, the banker is being transformed into an industrial capitalist. This bank capital, i.e. capital in money form, which is thus actually transformed into industrial capital, I call finance capital. Finance capital is capital controlled by banks and employed by industrialists. End quote. This definition is incomplete insofar as it is silent on one extremely important fact: the increase of concentration of production and of capital to such an extent that concentration leads and has led to monopoly. But throughout the whole of his work, and particularly in the two chapters which precede the one from which this definition is taken, Hilferding stresses the part played by capitalist monopolies. The concentration of production, the monopolies arising therefrom, the merging or coalescence of the banks with industry, such is the history of the rise of finance capital, and such is the content of this term. We now have to describe how, under the general conditions of commodity production and private property, the business operations of capitalist monopolies inevitably become the domination of a financial oligarchy. It should be noted that the representatives of bourgeois German, and not only German science, like Reiser, Schulze, Gavernitz, Leifman, and others, are apologists of imperialism and of finance capital. Instead of revealing the mechanics of the formation of an oligarchy, its methods, the size of its revenues, innocent and sinful, its connections with parliaments, etc., etc., they obscure and embellish them. They evade these vexed questions by pompous and vague phrases, appeals to the sense of responsibility of bank directors, by praising the sense of duty of Prussian officials, giving serious study to the petty details of absolutely ridiculous parliamentary bills for the supervision and regulation of monopolies, playing spillikins with theories like, for example, the following scientific definition arrived at by Professor Leifman. Quote, commerce is an occupation having for its object collecting goods, storing them, and making them available. End quote. Professor's italics. From this, it would follow that commerce existed in the time of primitive man, who knew nothing about exchange, and that it will exist under socialism. But the monstrous facts concerning the monstrous rule of the financial oligarchy are so glaring that in all capitalist countries, in America, France, and Germany, a whole literature has sprung up, written from the bourgeois point of view, but which, nevertheless, gives a fairly truthful picture and criticism, petit bourgeois, naturally, of this oligarchy. The holding system, to which we have already briefly referred above, should be made the cornerstone. The German economist Hyman, probably the first to call attention to this matter, describes the essence of it in this way. Quote, the head of the concern controls the principal company, literally the mother company. The latter reigns over the subsidiary companies, daughter companies, which in their turn control still other subsidiaries, grandchild companies, etc. End quote. Quote, in this way, it is possible with a comparatively small capital to dominate immense spheres of production. Indeed, if holding 50% of the capital is always sufficient to control a company, the head of the concern needs only 1 million to control 8 million in the second subsidiaries. And if this interlocking is extended, it is possible with 1 million to control 16 million, 32 million, etc. End quote. As a matter of fact, experience shows that it is sufficient to own 40% of the shares of a company in order to direct its affairs, since a certain number of small, scattered shareholders find it impossible in practice to attend general meetings, etc. The democratization of the ownership of shares, which from the bourgeois sophists and opportunist so-called social democrats expect, or say they expect, the democratization of capital, the strengthening of the role and significance of small-scale production, etc., is, in fact, one of the ways of increasing the power of the financial oligarchy. Incidentally, this is why, in the more advanced or in the older and more experienced capitalist countries, the law allows the issue of shares of smaller denomination. In Germany, the law does not permit the issue of shares of less than 1,000 marks denomination, and the magnates of German finance look with an envious eye at England, where the issue of £1 shares, equivalent to 20 marks, about 10 rubles, is permitted. Siemens, one of the biggest industrialists and financial kings in Germany, told the Reichstag on June 7, 1900, that, quote, the £1 share is the basis of British imperialism, end quote. This merchant has a much deeper and more Marxian understanding of imperialism than a certain disreputable writer who is held to be one of the founders of Russian Marxism and believes that imperialism is a bad habit of a certain nation. But the holding system not only serves enormously to increase the power of the monopolist, it also enables them to resort with impunity to all sorts of shady and dirty tricks to cheat the public. For the directors of the mother company are not legally responsible for the daughter company, which is supposed to be independent, and through the medium of which they can pull off anything. Here is an example taken from the German review, Die Bank, for May 1914. Quote, the Spring Steel Company of Kassel was regarded some years ago as being one of the most profitable enterprises in Germany. Through bad management, its dividends fell from 15% to nil. It appears that the board, without consulting the shareholders, had loaned 6 million marks to one of its daughter companies, the Hasia Limited, which had a nominal capital of only some hundreds of thousands of marks. This commitment, amounting to nearly treble the capital of the mother company, was never mentioned in its balance sheets. This omission was quite legal and could be hushed up for 2 whole years because it did not violate any point of company law. The chairman of the supervisory board, who was the responsible head, had signed the false balance sheets, was and still is the president of the Kassel Chamber of Commerce. The shareholders only heard of the loan to the Hasia Limited long afterwards, when it had been proved to have been a mistake. The writer should put this word in quotation marks. And when Spring Steel shares dropped nearly 100% because those in the know were getting rid of them. This typical example of balance sheet jugglery, quite common in joint stock companies, explains why their boards of directors are willing with a far lighter heart to undertake risky transactions than individual businessmen. Modern methods of drawing up balance sheets not only make it possible to conceal doubtful undertakings from the ordinary shareholder, but also allow the people most concerned to escape the consequences of unsuccessful speculation by selling their shares in time, while the individual businessman risks his own skin in everything he does. The balance sheets of many joint stock companies put us in mind of the palimpsests of the Middle Ages, from which the visible inscription had first to be erased in order to discover beneath it another inscription giving the real meaning of the document. Palimpsests are parchment documents which from the original inscription had been obliterated and another inscription imposed. The simplest and therefore most common procedure for making balance sheets indecipherable is to divide a single business into several parts by setting up daughter companies, or by annexing such. The advantages of this system for various objects, legal and illegal, are so evident that big companies which do not employ it are quite the exception. End quote. As an example of a huge monopolist company that extensively employs this system, the author quotes the famous General Electric Company, to which we shall refer again later on. In 1912, it was calculated that this company held shares in 175 to 200 other companies, dominating them, of course, and thus controlling a total capital of about 1,500,000,000 marks. All rules of control, the publication of balance sheets, the drawing up of balance sheets according to a definite form, the public auditing of accounts, etc., the things about which well-intentioned professors and officials, that is, those imbued with the good intention of defending and embellishing capitalism, discourse to the public, are of no avail. For private property is sacred, and no one can be prohibited from buying, selling, exchanging, or mortgaging shares, etc. The extent to which the holding system has developed in the big Russian banks may be judged from the figures given by E. Agid, who for 15 years was an official of the Russo-Chinese Bank and who, in May 1914, published a book not altogether correctly entitled Big Banks in the World Market. The author divides the big Russian banks into two main categories. A, banks that come under the holding system, and B, independent banks. Independence, however, being arbitrarily taken to mean independence of foreign banks. The author divides the first group into three subgroups: 1, German holdings, 2, British holdings, and 3, French holdings, having in view the holdings and domination of the big foreign banks of the particular country mentioned. The author divides the capital of the banks into productively invested capital in industrial and commercial undertakings and speculatively invested capital in stock exchange and financial operations, assuming from his petty bourgeois reformist point of view that it is possible under capitalism to separate the first form of investment from the second and to abolish the second form. Here are the figures he supplies. According to these figures, of the approximately 4 billion rubles making up the working capital of the big banks, more than 3/4, more than 3 billion, belonged to banks which in reality were only daughter companies of foreign banks, and chiefly of the Paris banks, the famous trio, Union Parisienne, Paris et Pays-Bas, and Société Générale, and of the Berlin banks, particularly the Deutsche Bank and the Diskontogesellschaft. Two of the biggest Russian banks, the Russian Bank for Foreign Trade and the International St. Petersburg International Commercial Bank, between 1906 and 1912, increased their capital from 44 million to 98 million rubles and their reserves from 15 million to 39 million, employing 3/4 German capital. The first bank belongs to the Berlin Deutsche Bank concern and the second to the Berlin Diskontogesellschaft. The worthy Agid is deeply indignant at the fact that the majority of the shares are held by the Berlin banks, and that, therefore, the Russian shareholders are powerless. Naturally, the country which exports capital skims the cream. For example, the Berlin Deutsche Bank, in placing the shares of the Siberian Commercial Bank on the Berlin market, kept them in its portfolio for a whole year and then sold them at the rate of 193 to 100. That is, at nearly twice their nominal value, earning a profit of nearly 6 million rubles, which Hilferding calls promoters' profits. Our author puts the total capacity of the principal St. Petersburg banks at 8,235,000,000 rubles, about 8.25 billions, and the holdings, or rather, the extent to which foreign banks dominated them, he estimates as follows. French banks, 55%, English, 10%, German, 35%. The author calculates that of the total of 8,235,000,000 rubles of functioning capital, 3,687,000,000 rubles, or 40%, fall to the share of the syndicates Produgel and Prodamet, and the syndicates in the oil, metallurgical, and cement industries. Thus, owing to the formation of capitalist monopolies, the merging of bank and industrial capital has also made enormous strides in Russia. Finance capital, concentrated in a few hands and exercising a virtual monopoly, enacts enormous and ever-increasing profits from the floating of companies, issue of stock, state loans, etc., strengthens the domination of the financial oligarchy, and levies tribute upon the whole of society for the benefit of monopolists. Here is an example. taken from a multitude of others, of the business methods of the American trust, quoted by Hilferding. In 1887, Havemeyer founded the Sugar Trust by amalgamating 15 small firms whose total capital amounted to $6,500,000. Suitably watered, as the Americans say, the capital of the trust was declared to be $50 million. This overcapitalization anticipated the monopoly profits in the same way as the United States Steel Corporation anticipates its future monopoly profits in buying up as many iron ore fields as possible. In fact, the Sugar Trust set up monopoly prices, which secured it such profits that it could pay 10% dividend on capital watered sevenfold, or about 70% on the capital actually invested at the time the trust was formed. In 1909, the capital of the Sugar Trust amounted to $90 million. In 22 years, it had increased its capital more than tenfold. In France, the domination of the financial oligarchy against the financial oligarchy in France, the title of the well-known book by Lysis, the fifth edition of which was published in 1908, assumed a form that was only slightly different. For the most powerful banks enjoy not a relative but an absolute monopoly in the issue of bonds. In reality, this is a trust of big banks. A monopoly ensures monopolist profits from bond issues. Usually, a borrowing country does not get more than 90% of the sum of the loan. The remaining 10% goes to the banks and other middlemen. The profit made by the banks out of the Russo-Chinese loan of 400 million francs amounted to 8%. Out of the Russian 1904 loan of 800 million francs, the profit amounted to 10%. And out of the Moroccan 1904 loan of 62,500,000 francs, it amounted to 18.75%. Capitalism, which began its development with petty usury capital, is ending its development with gigantic usury capital. The French, says Lysis, are the usurers of Europe. All the conditions of economic life are being profoundly modified by this transformation of capitalism. With a stationary population and stagnant industry, commerce, and shipping, the country can grow rich by usury. Quote, 50 persons representing a capital of 8 million francs can control 2 billion francs deposited in 4 banks. End quote. The holding system with which we are already familiar leads to the same result. One of the biggest banks, the Société Générale, for instance, issues 64,000 bonds for its daughter company, the Egyptian sugar refineries. The bonds are issued at 150%, i.e., the bank gains 50 centimes on the franc. The dividends of the new company were found to be fictitious. The public lost from 90 to 100 million francs. Quote, one of the directors of the Société Générale was a member of the board of directors of the sugar refineries. End quote. It is not surprising that the author is driven to the conclusion that, quote, the French Republic is a financial monarchy, end quote. Quote, it is the complete domination of the financial oligarchy. The latter dominates over the press and the government, end quote. An extraordinary high rate of profit obtained from the issue of securities, which is one of the principal functions of finance capital, plays a very important part in the development and consolidation of the financial oligarchy. Quote, there is not a single business of this type within the country that brings in profits even approximately equal to those obtained from the flotation of foreign loans, end quote, says the German magazine Die Bank. Quote, no banking operation brings in profits comparable with those obtained from the issue of securities, end quote. According to the German economists, the average annual profits made on the issue of industrial stock were as follows. Oh, my God. Quote, In the 10 years from 1891 to 1900, more than 1 billion marks were earned by issuing German industrial stock. End quote. During the periods of industrial boom, the profits of finance capital are immense. But during periods of depression, small and unsound businesses go out of existence. The big banks acquire holdings in them by buying them up for a mere song or participate in profitable schemes for their reconstruction and reorganization. In the reconstruction of undertakings which have been running at a loss, the share capital is written down. That is, profits are distributed on a smaller capital and continue to be calculated on this smaller basis. Or if the income has fallen to zero, new capital is called in, which, combined with the old and less remunerative capital, will bring in an adequate return. Incidentally, adds Hilferding, all these organizations and reconstructions have a twofold significance for the banks. First, as profitable transactions, and secondly, as opportunities for securing control of the companies in difficulties. End quote. Here is an instance. The Union Mining Company of Dortmund was founded in 1872. Share capital was issued to the amount of nearly 40 million marks, and the market price of the shares rose to 170 after it had paid a 12% dividend for its first year. Finance capital skimmed the cream and earned a trifle of something like 28 million marks. The principal sponsor of this company was that very big German Diskonto Gesellschaft, which so successfully attained a capital of 300 million marks. Later, the dividends of the union declined to nil. The shareholders had to consent to a writing down of capital, that is, to losing some of it in order not to lose it all. By a series of reconstructions, more than 73 million marks were written off the books of the union in the course of 30 years. Quote, at the present time, the original shareholders of the company possess only 5% of the nominal value of their shares. End quote. But the banks earned something out of every reconstruction. Speculation in land situated in the suburbs of rapidly growing big towns is a particularly profitable operation for finance capital. The monopoly of the banks merges here with the monopoly of ground rent and with monopoly of the means of communications, since the rise in the price of land and the possibility of selling it profitably in allotments, etc., is mainly dependent on good means of communication with the center of the town. And these means of communication are in the hands of large companies which are connected by means of the holding system and by the distribution of positions on the directorates with the interested banks. As a result, we get what the German writer L. Eschfage, a contributor to Die Bank, has made a special study of real estate business and mortgages, etc., calls a bog. Frantic speculation in suburban building lots, collapse of building enterprises like that of the Berlin firm of Boswell and Nauer, which raked in as much as 100 million marks with the help of the sound and solid Deutsche Bank, the latter, of course, acting through the holding system, i.e. secretly behind the scenes, and getting out of it with a loss of only 12 million marks. Then the ruin of small proprietors and of workers who get nothing from the fictitious building firms, fraudulent deals with the honest Berlin police and administration for the purpose of gaining control of the issue of building site tenders, building licenses, etc., etc. American ethics, which the European professors and well-meaning bourgeois so hypocritically deplore, have in the age of finance capital become the ethics of literally every large city and every country. At the beginning of 1914, there was talk in Berlin of the formation of a transport trust, i.e., of establishing community of interest between three Berlin transport undertakings: the City Electric Railway, the Tramway Company, and the Omnibus Company. We have known, wrote Die Bank, that this plan is contemplated since it became known that the majority of the shares in the bus company had been acquired by the other two transport companies. We may fully believe those who are pursuing this aim when they say that by uniting the transport services, they will secure economies, part of which will in time benefit the public. But the question is complicated by the fact that behind the transport trust that is being formed are the banks, which, if they desire, can subordinate the means of transportation, which they have monopolized, to the interests of their real estate business. To be convinced of the reasonableness of such a conjecture, we need only recall that the interests of the big bank that encouraged the formation of the elevated railway company were already involved in it at the time the company was formed. This is to say, the interests of this transport undertaking were interlocked with the real estate interest. The point is that the eastern line of this railway was to run through lands which, when it became certain the line was to be laid down, this bank sold at an enormous profit for itself and for several partners in the transactions. A monopoly, once it is formed and controls thousands of millions, inevitably penetrates into every sphere of public life, regardless of the form of government and all other details. In the economic literature of Germany, one usually comes across obsequious praise of the integrity of the Prussian bureaucracy and allusions to the French Panama scandal and to political corruption in America. But the fact is that even the bourgeois literature devoted to German banking matters constantly has to go far beyond the field of purely banking operations and to speak, for instance, about the attraction of the banks in reference to the increasing frequency with which public officials take employment with the banks as follows. Quote, how about the integrity of a state official who in his inmost heart is aspiring to a soft job at the Baronstrasse? End quote. The street in Berlin in which the head office of the Deutsche Bank is situated. In 1909, the publisher of Die Bank, Alfred Landsberg, wrote an article entitled The Economic Significance of Byzantinism, in which he incidentally referred to Wilhelm II's tour of Palestine and to the immediate result of his journey, the construction of the Baghdad Railway, that fatal great product of German enterprise, which is more responsible for the encirclement than all their political blunders put together. End quote. By encirclement is meant the policy of Edward VII to isolate Germany and surround her with an imperialist anti-German alliance. In 1911, Eschwege, the contributor to the same magazine to whom we already referred, wrote an article entitled Plutocracy and Bureaucracy, in which he exposed, for example, the case of a German official named Volker, who was a zealous member of the cartel committee and who, it turned out some time later, obtained a lucrative post in the biggest cartel, i.e. the Steel Syndicate. Similar cases, by no means casual, forced this bourgeois author to admit that the economic liberty guaranteed by the German Constitution has become in many departments of economic life a meaningless phrase, and that under the existing rule of the plutocracy, even the widest political liberty cannot save us from being converted into a nation of unfree people. As for Russia, we will limit ourselves to one example. Some years ago, all the newspapers announced that Davidov, the director of the credit department of the Treasury, had resigned his post to take employment with a certain big bank at a salary which, according to the contract, was to amount to over 1 million rubles in the course of several years. The credit department is an institution, the function of which is to coordinate the activities of all the credit institutions of the country, and which grants subsidies to banks in St. Petersburg and Moscow, amounting to between 800 and 1,000 million rubles. It is characteristic of capitalism in general that the ownership of capital is separated from the application of capital to production, that money capital is separated from industrial or productive capital, and that the rentier who lives entirely on income obtained from money capital is separated from the entrepreneur and from all who are directly concerned in the management of capital. Imperialism, or the domination of finance capital, is that highest stage of capitalism at which this separation reaches vast proportions. The supremacy of finance capital over all other forms of capital means the predominance of the rentier and of the financial oligarchy. It means the singling out of a small number of financially powerful states from among all the rest. The extent to which this process is going on may be judged from the statistics on emissions, i.e. the issue of all kinds of securities. In the Bulletin of the International Statistical Institute, A. Neymark has published very comprehensive, complete, and comparative figures covering the issue of securities all over the world. which have been repeatedly quoted in part in economic literature. The following are the totals he gives for decades. In the 1870s, the total amount of issues for the whole world was high, owing particularly to the loans floated in connection with the Franco-Prussian War and the company promoting boom which set in Germany after the war. On the whole, the increase is relatively not very rapid during the 3 last decades of the 19th century, and only in the first 10 years of the 20th century is an enormous increase observed of almost 100%. Thus, the beginning of the 20th century marks the turning point, not only in regard to the growth of monopolies, cartels, syndicates, trusts, of which we have already spoken, but also in regard to the growth of finance capital. Neymark estimates the total amount of issued securities current in the world in 1910 at about 815 billion francs. Deducting from the sum amounts which might have been duplicated, he reduces the total to 575 to 600 billion, which is distributed among the various countries as follows. We will take 600 billion. From these figures, we at once see standing out in sharp relief four of the richest capitalist countries, each of which holds securities to amounts ranging approximately from 100 to 150 billion francs. Of these four countries, two, England and France, are the oldest capitalist countries, and as we shall see, possess the most colonies. The other two, the United States and Germany, are leading capitalist countries as regards rapidity of development and the degree of extension of capitalist monopolies and industry. Together, these four countries own 479 billion francs, that is, nearly 80% of the world's finance capital. In one way or another, nearly the whole of the rest of the world is more or less the debtor to and tributary of these international banker countries, these four pillars of world finance capital. It is particularly important to examine the part which the export of capital plays in creating the international network of dependence and connections of finance capital. We will end this section at the top of page 72.